Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her when he thought she couldn't hear him in the supply closet at Sacred Heart Hospital. Just a nurse who kept her head down and her mouth shut and didn't belong in his emergency room asking questions about inventory. He had no idea who he was standing next to. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead at 2,347 hours on a Tuesday night, and Brooke Sullivan clocked in for another overnight shift, rain still clinging to her shoulders like a burden she'd learned to carry without flinching. He didn't see the scar tissue on her hands. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked trauma patterns like a hunter reading wind. He didn't see the senior chief petty officer standing in scrubs, erased from classified records 20 years ago, the woman who'd walked through fire in Kandahar and come out the other side empty of everything but discipline. What happened next didn't just change the hospital. It changed him. The night air held the smell of salt and rain, that particular Savannah humidity that clung to everything like a second skin. Brooke pushed through the ER entrance at 11:47, her badge already in hand, her movements efficient and economical. Every motion had a purpose. No wasted energy. No unnecessary sound. She'd learned long ago that the quietest person in a room could be the most dangerous one, and she'd spent 20 years proving that by being the opposite of dangerous, by being helpful, by being invisible, by being exactly what they expected from someone with an RN after her name and nothing written on her face about the things she'd survived. Her faded field jacket hung in locker 47, tucked behind a spare pair of compression socks and a paperback mystery novel she'd been reading since 2019. The unit patch was sewn inside the lining, barely visible in the dim light, the mission date stitched in thread so faded it looked like a ghost had done the work. She never took that jacket home. This locker was her line of separation between what she was and what she pretended to be. The third-floor nurse's station at Sacred Heart smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic, that particular combination that said overworked and understaffed on every shift. Brooke moved to the coffee station, poured a cup into a chipped mug that had been there for at least 3 years, and claimed the far corner of the desk where the computer monitor cast a blue glow that made everything look surgical. The overnight census was 38 patients. Trauma Bay 1 had a motorcycle accident from 40 minutes ago. ICU Bed 7 had a post-op bowel resection they were monitoring for sepsis signs. Room 12 had a woman in her 60s who'd come in complaining of chest pain that the cardiac workup hadn't explained yet, which meant nobody knew what was wrong, and that meant Brooke would be checking on her every 40 minutes until they did. She opened the inventory file on her screen and began to read. That's when she saw it. A phantom charge for 15 units of 14-gauge angiocath needles on Tuesday's supply order, but the trauma log showed only 4 units used. Surplus needles didn't just vanish. Brooke pulled the previous week's records and found the same pattern. 18 units ordered, 12 units logged. She made a note in the margin of her handwritten log, the one she kept separate from the official system because she'd learned early in her career that some patterns took time to see clearly. The human eye couldn't catch everything in real time, but it could catch it later if you looked hard enough. She knew how to look. The ER director arrived at midnight like he owned the place, which in a way he did. Dr. Marcus Hargrove had been at Sacred Heart for 7 years, had the ear of the hospital administrator, and wore cufflinks that probably cost more than Brooke's entire monthly paycheck. He had the kind of face that expected deference, sharp cheekbones, slicked-back dark hair, a smile that appeared and disappeared like a light switch. His watch caught the fluorescent light when he moved, a silver Rolex that probably had its own trust fund. He flipped through the supply reports with one hand while holding his phone in the other, his jaw tightening with each page he turned. Brooke watched him from her corner of the desk without appearing to watch him. It was a skill. The ability to observe everything while seeming focused entirely on your work. She'd spent 20 years perfecting it. These numbers are off, Hargrove said to nobody in particular, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice had the texture of someone used to being listened to, someone who didn't bother softening his words for people beneath him. Someone's not tracking supplies correctly. He flipped to the next page. His eyes narrowed. Who's been doing the inventory reconciliation? His gaze swept the station and landed on Brooke, who was still looking at her monitor with the kind of focus that suggested she hadn't heard him at all. But she had. She always did. Brooke looked up slowly, no rush in the movement, no eagerness to please. That's been me for the last 18 months, doctor. Pull the discrepancy reports. He said it like an order, not a request. I want every variance from the last month. Every single one. She nodded once and turned back to her computer. 2 minutes later she'd printed 8 pages of documentation, phantom charges, missing items, supplies that appeared on orders but never on usage logs, a pattern so clear that any person with functional eyes could see it. Hargrove snatched the papers from her hands, and his expression shifted. Not to gratitude. To something sharper. Something like a predator recognizing a threat. Because Brooke Sullivan wasn't just noting discrepancies. She was finding them. She was tracking them. She was keeping documentation that a competent lawyer could use as evidence. She'd circled the suspicious items in red pen. She'd written dates and amounts in careful, precise handwriting. She'd done the exact opposite of what someone like him wanted. She'd paid attention. She'd seen too much. 20 years earlier, in a different world entirely, Brooke had been someone else. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. Call sign Raven. She'd been 32 years old, not the 48 she was now, and she'd been moving through Kandahar province in Helmand with a tactical support team from Naval Special Warfare Command, the kind of classified operation that didn't appear in official records, that didn't have a budget line, that would be denied by every official who mattered if anyone ever asked the right questions. The heat had been 134 degrees. The dust had gotten into everything, weapons, water bottles, the spaces between your ribs where you tried to keep your heart from breaking. They'd been clearing compounds on a Thursday morning, a routine patrol that turned into an active firefight when insurgent forces opened up from a neighboring building with small arms and an RPG that came close enough that she felt the heat signature on her face. The children had been in the compound. That was the part that never left you. The part that etched itself into your bones and stayed there, a permanent reminder of why you did this work and why you had to do it perfectly every single time. A 5-year-old boy with eyes like smoke had been huddled behind an overturned table, and when the firefight started, he was in the blast radius of the RPG that impacted the wall 12 feet from his position. Shrapnel. Concussive force. Bleeding from his left ear. No pulse at the carotid. Brooke had moved on instinct. She'd left her position, exposed herself in a crossfire that made her team scream her call sign into the radio, and she'd pulled that child out of the compound and into a building 2 structures over. She'd done a tactical assessment, airway intact, breathing shallow, circulation present but weak. She'd performed a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right through the dust and the adrenaline and the sound of machine gun fire that was close enough to feel like someone was screaming in her ear. The hiss of air escaping from the needle was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard because it meant the child's lungs could expand again, meant his heart had room to beat, meant he was going to live. The boy's name was Amir. His father had been a translator. His mother was dead. He had no one. By the time the mission was officially terminated 3 days later, by the time the Pentagon classified the operation under a designation so secret it didn't have a name, Amir Khan had been placed in protective custody with a new family, a new name status, a new life that couldn't be traced back to the woman who'd saved him. The official report stated that Brooke Sullivan had died in a training accident in the mountains outside Bagram. The military had erased her. No record. No pension documentation. No official acknowledgement that she'd ever existed in uniform. She was a ghost to the institution that had trained her, and she'd been a ghost ever since, working in civilian hospitals, keeping her head down, taking night shifts where she could move through the world like a phantom, visible but unremarkable, there but not there. She'd promised her husband she would stay buried. She'd promised him on the night she told him the truth, before the cancer took him 3 years ago, before Marcus had held her hand and said, "Baby, you served your country and they told you to disappear, so disappear. Keep our son safe. Raise Marcus to be good. Don't let this life touch him. Promise me." She'd promised. And she'd kept that promise by becoming less and less visible with every passing year, by fading so completely into the background of Sacred Heart Hospital that most people couldn't tell you her name if you asked them later, couldn't describe her face because she'd learned to make it unremarkable, hadn't learned to smile or make small talk or let anyone close enough to see the scars on her wrists and her ribs and the inside of her thigh where the shrapnel had caught her a half-second before she pulled Amir to safety. Hargrove stared at the discrepancy report, his jaw working, his expensive fingers clenching the paper like he wanted to rip it apart. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Brooke could read it on his face clear as a printed report. She'd become a problem. She noticed things. She documented them. She was the kind of employee who paid attention, and people who paid attention were threats to people like him. He folded the papers once, then again, and walked away toward his office without dismissing her or acknowledging her or treating her like anything other than an obstacle that needed to be managed. Brooke turned back to her monitor and pulled up the cardiac workup on the woman in room 12. Troponin levels. EKG tracings. Blood pressure readings. All of it pointing toward something that the daytime doctors had missed because they'd been too busy, too distracted, too focused on the urgent cases to see the dangerous ones that looked quiet. Pain was information. She'd learned that in combat and never forgotten it. Every reading, every vital sign, every number was the body trying to tell you what was wrong if you'd just listen carefully enough. She checked the clock. 0023 hours. 19 minutes until her next round. She finished her coffee and stood, moving through the ER with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects, and she moved beneath them like someone who'd learned to live in the spaces where most people never looked. The next words out of Dr. Hargrove's mouth, spoken into his phone in his office where he didn't think anyone could hear him, changed everything. The coffee in the nurse's station smelled like burnt rubber. It had been sitting in the pot since midnight, and it was now 0100 hours when Drive Hargrove leaned against the counter, his tailored white coat pristine, his jaw working a piece of gum like he was grinding bone. Brooke stood 3 feet away, charting vitals on a post-op patient, her pen moving in steady, deliberate strokes across the form. She could feel him watching her. She always could. "Gentlemen." "Ladies," Hargrove announced, loud enough to pull attention from the 2 residents and 3 other nurses scattered through the station. "I'm making a public prediction." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never lost an argument with someone without institutional power. "Our meticulous Miss Sullivan here won't last another week. I'm betting $50 she walks out that door by Friday." He looked directly at Brooke. "Anyone want to take that action?" Laughter crackled through the room like static electricity. One of the younger nurses, Jessica, actually giggled. A resident named Chen exchanged a glance with Hargrove that communicated perfect understanding. They were in on the same joke, and Brooke was the punchline. She didn't look up from her charting. Her pen didn't pause. Her fingers didn't tremble. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their monotonous, maddening frequency, and she counted the hums like a meditation. 1, 2, 3. Her jaw tightened, but only by a millimeter, enough that she felt the muscle flex, not enough that anyone could see it move. "That's insulting, Doctor," one of the senior nurses, Patricia, said quietly. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a gentle correction, the way you might tell someone their fly was unzipped. "It's observation," Hargrove replied smoothly. He turned back to his coffee, dismissing the objection and Brooke simultaneously. "She's got that fragile look. Haunted. Probably dealing with some personal crisis we'll never know about. People like that don't last in trauma." The words hung in the air like a bad smell. People like that. As if fragility and haunting were diagnoses he could read from her vitals. As if strength had a uniform and hers didn't fit it. Brooke closed her chart and set her pen down with quiet precision. She walked to the supply room without a word, her movements mechanical, controlled. The door swung shut behind her with a soft whisper. For 30 seconds, she stood alone among the boxes of gauze and catheter kits, her hands pressed flat against the cool metal shelving. In her mind, she was back in Kandahar, 2004, the sound of gunfire so close it vibrated in her molars. She was back in the basement of a half-collapsed schoolhouse, hands buried in dust and blood, a 5-year-old boy's scream in her ears. She had been knocked down then, knocked down by gravity itself when an RPG detonated 30 meters away. She had gotten up. She had walked out carrying a child while rounds pinged off the concrete around her shoulders. She would survive this. She would survive anything. When she returned to the station, she said nothing about the bet. She continued her rounds. She checked medications. She ran an EKG on a 63-year-old with chest pain. She was a ghost, visible but not quite present, and that was how she preferred to work. 2 nights later, the assault came more direct. Brooke was in the cafeteria at 0300 during her break, the hour when the world felt hollow and time moved sideways. She carried a tray, soup in a ceramic bowl, saltine crackers in their plastic sleeve, a bottle of water sweating condensation. The fluorescent lights here were different, softer, painted a shade of institutional beige that made everyone look slightly cadaverous. She was walking from the serving line toward an empty table when Dr. Hargrove entered from the opposite direction. Their collision seemed casual. His elbow connected with her tray at exactly the right angle, the angle of someone who had practiced this before, perhaps 100 times, with people he wanted to unsettle. The bowl toppled. Soup cascaded across her scrubs in a burning splash, spreading across her abdomen in a pattern like a wound. The ceramic bowl shattered against the linoleum, fragments scattering across the floor like shrapnel. Clumsy, Hargrove said, stepping over the mess without breaking stride. Maybe nursing isn't for you. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew she wouldn't fight back. Brooke knelt slowly, gathering the broken pieces. Her scrubs dripped soup onto the floor. A maintenance worker emerged from the back with a mop, refusing to meet her eyes. He had seen this before, the theater of humiliation, and he had learned not to be a witness. She carried the pieces to the trash, disposed of them methodically, and walked to the linen closet where she kept a spare uniform in her locker. When she returned 30 minutes later, the floor had been cleaned. Her shift continued. She did not mention the incident to anyone. To do so would be to make it real, to give it substance beyond the simple fact of a spilled bowl. The third incident was the one that almost broke her. It happened during morning rounds, the sun just beginning to bleed pink through the eastern windows of Sacred Heart. Brooke was reviewing supply manifests with the night shift pharmacist when she noticed the discrepancy, a shipment of surgical-grade sterile saline marked as delivered on June 12 at 14:16 hours, but the equipment never appeared on the inventory ledger. 12 units. High-volume bags. The kind of thing that mattered when a patient was losing blood faster than you could replace it. She flagged it. That was her job. That was what meticulous people did, they flagged things that didn't add up. Dr. Hargrove was walking past the medication counter when he saw her pointing to the manifest in the pharmacist's hand. His entire posture changed. His shoulders squared. His jaw locked. He walked directly to her, pulled the patient chart from her hands, the chart for a post-op femoral bypass patient she had been monitoring, and held it for one suspended moment. In that moment, Brooke understood what was about to happen. She braced for it the way a soldier braces for impact. He threw the chart at her feet. Papers scattered across the tile floor in a chaotic cascade, white sheets falling like snow, numbers and dates and clinical observations spreading across 15 feet of hallway. The sound was the sound of something fragile breaking, not the chart itself, which was plastic and resilient, but something inside the architecture of respect and dignity. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Dr. Hargrove said, his voice low and pitched for her ears alone. "And stop asking questions that aren't your concern. You're a nurse. You change beds and hang fours. You don't audit supply chains. You don't question inventory procedures. You don't think. You follow orders. Understand?" Brooke stood motionless for 2 seconds. Around her, the hallway had gone silent. Patricia had stopped walking. The pharmacist had turned away, suddenly very interested in a bottle of metoprolol. The two residents exchanged glances that communicated exactly what they were witnessing, the complete evisceration of a subordinate by someone with power. She took one measured breath. Through her nose. Deep. Her shoulders remained level. Her hands remained at her sides. Then a single tear escaped. Just one. It rolled down her cheek with the inevitability of rain on a window. She didn't cry. She didn't let her face crumple. The tear was just a tear, a physical response, like a reflex, like her body remembering what it felt like to be humiliated by someone who didn't matter. She wiped it away with her right index finger, slow and deliberate. Then she looked directly at Dr. Hargrove. "I've been knocked down by better men than you, Doctor," she said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "And I'm still standing." The words hung in the hallway like a held breath. They weren't loud. They weren't accusatory. They were simply true, stated as fact, the way you might observe that the sky was blue or that blood was red. They carried the weight of something enormous beneath them, something she wasn't saying, but that everyone in that hallway suddenly, viscerally understood they didn't know. Dr. Hargrove's jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle fibers working. His face flushed from his collar upward, crimson spreading across his neck like an infection. For a moment, his eyes went very cold and very focused, and Brooke understood that she had made an error. Not in what she said, the words had been necessary, had been the only response that would allow her to continue existing as a human being rather than a target, but in the fact that she had said it at all. She had revealed something. Resilience. The kind of composure that didn't come from nursing school. The kind that came from surviving things that were meant to kill you. His hands clenched. "My office," he said quietly. "End of shift." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Brooke remained standing in the hallway, surrounded by scattered papers. She didn't move to pick them up immediately. She stood there, letting her breathing slow, letting her heart rate return to something approaching normal. Patricia came over and began gathering the pages without a word. The pharmacist pretended to reorganize the metoprolol bottles. The residents suddenly became very interested in their own tasks. By the time Brooke kneeled to collect the remaining papers, the moment had passed. But something had shifted. Dr. Hargrove had revealed his hand, and she had revealed something in return, not her secret, not yet, but the outline of it, the shadow cast by a life he couldn't quite comprehend. He would escalate now. She knew this with the certainty of someone who had survived bureaucratic warfare alongside the actual kind. Men like Hargrove didn't accept defiance. They destroyed it. And the next time, they would bring weapons. She had 3 days before everything changed. The ambulance bay doors exploded open at 0430 hours. 2 paramedics were running, pushing a stretcher, shouting vitals in clip bursts. Trauma incoming from Hunter Army Airfield. Paratrooper. Training accident. Shrapnel wounds, multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding. The ER night shift snapped into motion like a choreographed dance, beds prepped, monitors ready for lines hanging. Brooke stood at the nurse's station finishing her charting from the previous patient when she heard it, the particular cadence of military-grade trauma. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Her hands already knew what to do. The stretcher wheeled past her line of sight. A young man, maybe 30, his face contorted in pain, his left arm wrapped in field dressing soaked dark with blood. A medic was bagging oxygen. Another was calling out blood pressure, 118/76, holding steady. The patient's eyes were wide, scanning, trying to make sense of the fluorescent chaos around him. And then his temple caught the light. A thin scar, pale against darker skin. The kind of scar that came from shrapnel. The kind of scar Brooke had seen before. 20 years ago. In Kandahar. Her breath caught. Just for a second. Long enough that the resident walking past her didn't notice. Long enough that nobody saw the color drain from her face and return. The scar was on the boy's temple. The boy she had pulled from rubble during a firefight in the Jolan district. The boy whose name she had whispered once and never again. Amir Khan. 5 years old then. Now he was lying on that stretcher, his shrapnel wounds fresh, his pupils dilated, his body in shock. Brooke moved. Not fast. Not drawing attention. She simply rose from her chair and walked toward Trauma Bay 3, her movements indistinguishable from routine night shift protocol. The attending physician was already there, not Hargrove, thank God, a senior resident named Chen who actually knew what he was doing. 2 nurses were preparing lines. The paramedics transferred the patient with practiced efficiency. Brooke positioned herself on the left side of the bay, near the monitor, near the crash cart, where she could see and move without being questioned. The attending was good. Clean assessment. Let's get a full trauma panel, type and cross, massive transfusion protocol standby. The resident had the patient's vital signs stabilizing with 4 fluids, but Brooke was watching something the attending hadn't noticed yet. The patient's breathing was shallow on the left side. When the attending palpated his ribs, the young man's eyes rolled back with pain. Left lower lobe. Possible penetrating injury to the pleural cavity. The monitor showed normal O2 saturation now, but that could change in minutes. That could change in seconds. She watched. She said nothing. She waited, her mind already 3 steps ahead, already pulling inventory. Where was the 14-gauge angiocath? Where was the 3-way stopcock? Her hands, those same hands that had held this boy while medevac helicopters rotated overhead in Kandahar, remained perfectly still at her sides. Her face was blank. Professional. The kind of composure you developed when you had spent 20 years erasing yourself. The attending was ordering chest x-rays, calling radiology. Smart. But the patient was still shallow breathing, compensating. Brooke could hear it now. The wheeze underneath his normal breath sounds. The body trying to work around something wrong inside. She had heard this sound before. She had heard it while holding pressure on wounds in conditions you didn't have words for. She had heard it in the dark while waiting for dust-off. The attending was still talking to the resident. Both of them focused on the abdomen, looking for bleeding. Standard protocol. Check the obvious first. But Brooke's eyes were on the left side of the patient's chest, on the shallow rise and fall, on the faint tracheal deviation she could see in the neck. The attending still hadn't noticed. The resident definitely hadn't noticed. And Amir's oxygen saturation on the monitor was holding at 96%, which meant he was compensating beautifully. Which meant when he stopped compensating, he would crash hard. She moved to the monitor and adjusted the display angle slightly, making it easier to see. No one questioned this. Monitors had angles. You adjusted them. It was automatic. She was standing exactly where she needed to be. Exactly where she could move the fastest when his left lung collapsed. It happened at 0 for 47 hours. 48 minutes after the paramedics had wheeled him through those doors. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped from 96 to 94. Then 91. Then 88. His heart rate climbed from 98 to 118 to 142. His breathing became desperate, shallow gasping, his ribs flaring. His left chest wall looked different suddenly, less full than the right. The trachea was deviating. The attending's head snapped toward the monitor. Tension pneumothorax, Brooke said. Flat. Certain. Not asking. Stating. The attending looked at her for 1/2 second, long enough to recognize she might be right, long enough to hesitate, and that 1/2 second was all the time Amir's collapsing lung needed. His lips were turning blue. His hands were clawing. His oxygen saturation was 74 now, falling like a stone. Brooke moved. Not asking permission. Not waiting for orders. She grabbed the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her fingers finding it by muscle memory, the same muscle memory that had kept her alive in places that didn't exist on maps. She counted ribs with her free hand. 1. 2. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She found it like she had done it 1,000 times. She had done it 1,000 times. Her other hand steadied the chest wall. The needle went in smooth and clean. The hiss of air escaping was immediate. Sudden. Violent. Like a breath the patient's own body had been holding for 4 decades. Amir gasped. His back arched off the stretcher. Color flooded back into his lips. His oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed, 76. 82, 88. 94, his heart rate was still high, still panicked, but he was breathing now. He was alive now. He was looking up at her, his eyes wide, confused, in shock, and Brooke kept her face absolutely still because she recognized him and he couldn't recognize her. She was nobody. She was just a nurse in scrubs with blood on her gloves, and she had learned 20 years ago that being nobody was the only way to survive knowing what she knew. The attending was calling out orders now, moving fast, the crisis response kicking in late but hard. Get radiology on the phone. I need a chest x-ray, stat. Arrange transfer to ICU, respiratory standing by. The resident was fumbling with the 14-gauge needle that had just stopped the hemorrhage, securing it, confirming placement. The monitors were stabilizing. Amir was breathing. The room was moving now, the crisis contained, the patient saved. The attending glanced at Brooke for a fraction of a second. Good catch, Chen said. Not a question. An acknowledgement. Brooke stepped back. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. He would have coded in 90 seconds, she said quietly. Just stating facts. Just reporting what the physics of a collapsed lung meant. The attending nodded. He was already focused on the next thing, the transfer, the imaging, the stabilization. That was his job. Her job was done. She had done it. She had saved him without touching the part of his identity that mattered. She had saved the paratrooper. Not the boy. Never the boy. The boy had to stay buried. The boy from Kandahar had to stay dead. She turned to leave the trauma bay, moving toward the supply room to grab fresh gloves, to get the blood off her hands. But that was when she heard Hargrove's voice from the doorway. What the hell do you think you're doing? His voice was sharp. Furious. The kind of fury that came from watching someone else be right when he needed them to be wrong. That's beyond your scope. You don't perform procedures. You assist physicians. You follow protocol. The room went quiet. Not silent. Quiet was something else. Quiet was the absence of sound. This was the absence of everything. Brooke turned around slowly. She looked at Hargrove standing in the doorway of the trauma bay, his face already flushed, his hands clenched at his sides. Behind him, through the window of the ER nursing station, staff were watching. They were all watching now. Brooke set down her gloves deliberately. One at a time. Deliberately. She looked at Hargrove, and when she spoke, her voice was so quiet that only the people in the trauma bay could hear it. Not because she was being meek. Because she was being lethal. Because the quietest voice in a room is always the one with the knife. He would have died in 90 seconds, she said. I need some jello. And she walked past Hargrove without waiting for his response, without looking at his face, without giving him anything at all. Behind her, she heard Amir breathing. Alive. Stable. The scar on his temple was still there. The boy was still in there somewhere. But he was breathing. And Brooke Sullivan was still nobody. Still invisible. Still walking toward something she didn't yet know was the end of her time at Sacred Heart Hospital. Still carrying the weight of a name she couldn't claim. By 1900 hours that evening, before Brooke's next shift was supposed to begin, Hargrove had made 3 phone calls. The first was to a board member who owed him a favor. The second was to the 2 fabricated references on Brooke's personnel file, planting doubts about her credentials, her judgment, her fitness for duty. The third was to an outside risk management investigator who specialized in building termination cases. By 2200 hours, Brooke was called into the administrator's office. Hargrove sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with the kind of rage that came from losing control of a narrative he thought he owned. The administrator read from a prepared script. Insubordination. Reckless endangerment. Practicing beyond scope. Effective immediately. Security would escort her out. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital with her hands empty and her face blank, and somewhere in a trauma bay behind her, a paratrooper she had saved in another lifetime was breathing oxygen he wouldn't have had if she had followed the rules. That would have to be enough. That evening, before Brooke's next shift could begin, the universe made its decision for her. Amir Khan crashed at 1900 hours. He was being transferred from the observation unit to the trauma wing when his breathing changed, a sound like air leaving a punctured tire. The ventilator alarm screamed first. Then came the silence underneath, the terrible silence of a lung collapsing in on itself. Tension pneumothorax. The air pocket between his lung and chest wall was crushing his heart like a fist closing. Brooke was still in the hospital. She'd stayed to review Amir's post-operative vitals, unable to leave the only proof that the last 20 years of invisibility had meant something. She was 3 floors down when the code blue echoed through the intercom, when the overhead system announced the patient name and location with mechanical indifference. She didn't think. Her feet moved toward the stairs while her mind was still catching up. The trauma bay was controlled chaos. 2 residents circled Amir like sharks smelling blood. Dr. Hargrove stood at the monitor, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, his face the color of old concrete. Amir's oxygen saturation dropped like a stone falling down a well, 92. 88. 74. His heart rate climbed, 160, 170, 180. The monitor screamed. Nobody moved. Brooke was through the door before she understood her own feet were carrying her. She saw the problem the way she'd seen 1,000 problems in 1,000 places where the only thing between dying and not dying was 30 seconds and steady hands. No chest rise on the left side. Subcutaneous emphysema rippling across his neck like water under ice. The pressure was building. The pressure was killing him. 14-gauge needle, she said. Not asked. Her voice had dropped into the register that didn't belong to the meek nurse who pushed medication carts. Dr. Hargrove stared at her like she'd materialized from another dimension. 14-gauge. Now. The resident fumbled through the crash cart. Brooke was already moving Amir's arm up and back, palpating the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers found the landmarks, the space between the ribs like the gap between 2 stones in a wall. This was muscle memory older than her identity as a nurse. This was hands that had done this in darkness, in rain, in chaos that made this trauma bay look like a meditation garden. She felt the needle go in. Felt the hiss of air escaping like a held breath finally released. The monitor's shriek softened to a whimper, then normalized into something almost human. Amir's oxygen saturation climbed in real time, 76. 82. 89. 93. His heart rate dropped from 180 to 140. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Living. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Dr. Hargrove stood with his hand still on the desk. He watched as Brooke secured a tube to the needle, as she confirmed bilateral breath sounds, as she did everything with the terrifying precision of someone who'd held lives together in her hands more times than she'd held hopes. His expression moved through stages, shock, then confusion, then something sharper. Recognition. Threat assessment. He watched her the way a predator watches its prey realize it was never the smaller animal in the room. Everyone out except respiratory, Brooke said, her voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. We need a chest tube set up. Page surgery. Tell them I said pulmonary is compromised. The residents moved like they'd been activated by a remote control. Nobody questioned her. Nobody asked Dr. Hargrove's permission. That was when he understood she'd just ended her career. By 2,100 hours, Hargrove had made 4 phone calls. By 21:30, he'd made 10. The network activated like a spider web vibrating from a single plucked strand. He called board member Patricia Vance, who owed him money from an equipment contract. He called Dr. Marcus Pierce at Memorial Hospital, who'd referred 3 different billing schemes his way. He called an outside investigator named Donald Krebs, whose only job was to find ammunition. By midnight, the narrative had been rewritten. Brooke hadn't responded to a medical emergency. She'd practiced medicine without a license. She hadn't saved a patient, she'd endangered one through reckless endangerment. The needle decompression was beyond her scope. Never mind that she'd done it perfectly. Never mind that she'd done it while Hargrove froze. The story was written before she'd even clocked out. At 0230 hours, security came to find her in the break room. She was sitting with a cold coffee, staring at nothing, waiting for the moment everyone would pretend was inevitable. They were courteous about it. Professional. They gave her the letter on hospital letterhead while a supervisor from HR stood far enough away to claim distance from the contamination. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated for insubordination and practicing beyond the scope of your licensed authority. Brooke took the letter. Didn't read it. Her hands were steady. Her face showed nothing. The part of her that had learned to disappear 20 years ago was already halfway gone. You'll need to return your badge and key card, the security guard said. He was sympathetic. That almost made it worse, the sympathy from someone who had no idea what he was watching unfold. She removed her badge. Placed it on the table. The laminate still held her photograph from 2 years ago, a face that looked like it had never been to war, never held a child, never been ordered to become someone else so completely that the original person could be locked in a vault and sealed. Dr. Hargrove watched from across the corridor, his arms crossed, his expression a masterwork of vindication. She could see him registering the win, storing the moment like a trophy. She didn't look at him. She walked toward the exit with her hospital ID in her hand and nothing else, while Hargrove's phone buzzed again, another board member confirming they'd received his message, another domino falling in a pattern he'd orchestrated before she'd even finished her life-saving procedure. The rain started while she walked to her car. Not gentle. Aggressive. The kind of rain that came down like judgment. Her car was a 2012 Honda Civic, unremarkable, forgettable, exactly what someone invisible would drive. She didn't go home. She couldn't face the house that still smelled like Michael, still held his uniforms in the closet, still had his photograph on the kitchen counter in a frame with no one else's face next to it. She drove to the veteran cemetery on the outskirts of Savannah, windshield wipers beating a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The gates were open even in the rain. Nobody closed gates on the dead. She parked under dripping oak trees draped in Spanish moss like funeral clothes and walked through mud that sucked at her shoes. Michael Sullivan's grave was in the 3rd row, marked by a black granite stone with his name and the dates of his life compressed into something that fit in a rectangle. Navy SEAL. Killed 4 years ago in a training accident that wasn't accidental and everyone knew it. Lost to something classified. Lost to the same world that had lost Brooke. She collapsed at the headstone, rain soaking through her scrubs jacket, turning the fabric heavy and dark. Her hand shook against the granite, real shaking now, the kind that happened when no one was watching. The trembling wasn't fear. It was everything she'd held back for 2 years finally finding a crack in the wall. "I promised you I'd keep my head down, baby," she whispered. Her voice broke like old glass. "I promised I'd stay invisible. That I'd never let them find me. That I'd keep Marcus safe." Rain hammered the cemetery like applause for her failure. "I saved that soldier and I failed you. I failed our boy. Everything you died protecting, I just threw it away because I couldn't watch him suffocate. Because I couldn't let him die when I knew how to stop it." Her fingers traced Michael's name carved into stone. Marcus is gonna lose everything now. His mother's invisible, and now she's invisible and unemployed and, the words stopped. The sobs came instead. She stayed there for an hour while the rain softened to drizzle, while the temperature dropped, while the world moved on without her. Her phone buzzed at 2,147 hours. A text from Marcus, "Mom, where are you? Please come home." She drove back in silence. The rain had stopped by the time she pulled into the driveway. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. She could see Marcus through the window, and the sight of him, 17, tall like his father, his jaw set with stubborn determination, nearly broke her again. She found him sitting at the kitchen table with the shadow box open in front of him. The one she'd hidden in the closet behind winter coats. The one that held the medals she'd been ordered never to acknowledge. "I heard what happened," Marcus said. His voice was steady in the way that only 17-year-olds who've decided something immovable can sound. "Mrs. Chen called the house looking for you. She said there was a patient emergency and you were amazing and then they fired you." Brooke stared at the medals. Navy Cross. Silver Star. Silver Star again. Purple Heart with 3 clusters, each one a wound that should have been fatal but wasn't. Everything she was supposed to have never been. "Put those away," she whispered. Marcus shook his head with the same stubborn refusal she recognized from the mirror. "No. Mom, they need to see these." "They can't, baby. The military erased my records. They were ordered to. I'm supposed to not exist. Do you understand? If I surface, then I'll surface you," Marcus said. He was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling that reporter from the Savannah Morning News. I'm calling the Navy. I'm calling everyone. They need to know what you are." Brooke tried to explain why that was impossible, why military records stayed buried for reasons classified and dangerous. She tried to invoke protocol and secrecy and the orders that had shaped her entire adult life. But Marcus was already making calls she couldn't hear, already sending emails with attachments she hadn't authorized, already deciding that invisibility was a worse choice than exposure. She sat at the table with her head in her hands while her son dismantled 20 years of careful obscurity. She should have stopped him. She should have reached across the table and taken his phone and said no with the authority of someone who'd spent her life in service of obedience. She was too broken to stop him. She was too tired to keep disappearing. The boardroom door exploded open at 0900 hours like a breaching charge, and Marcus Sullivan stood in the frame, 17 years old, holding a shadow box of military medals like a grenade he was about to detonate. His mother's medals. His father's uniform jacket hung off his shoulders, 2 sizes too large, and his voice shattered the morning silence like a rifle crack. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan." The shadow box hit the polished conference table with the weight of a judge's gavel. Board members flinched. Risk management investigators' pen froze mid-note. Dr. Hargrove's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Inside that box, arranged in perfect ceremonial order, a ribbon bar that told 20 years of classified stories. Enamel pins that represented operations never declassified. And beneath the medals, something that made the room's air pressure change, a faded unit patch, olive drab with a date embroidered in fraying gold thread. The head nurse stood slowly. Her name was Patricia Chen, 32 years at Sacred Heart, and her hands trembled as she reached for Brooke's old field jacket hanging on the back of an empty chair. Marcus had brought it. Patricia's fingers found the seam along the lining, the surgical precision of where something precious had been sewn and hidden for 2 decades. She lifted the patch free, so gently, as if she was handling classified history itself, which she was. "Mission dates," Patricia whispered, reading the embroidered numbers. Her voice carried across the table like a benediction. These match the classified operations. I remember reading about these in the Pentagon briefings my husband brought home before she couldn't finish. She didn't have to." The door opened again. Amir Khan limped in, his left shoulder still strapped, his scar, the temple scar, the one from shrapnel in Kandahar 20 years ago, catching the morning light falling through the boardroom windows. Behind him came his SEAL team leader, a man with a chest full of ribbons and a jawline that could cut glass. The officer wore his dress uniform like a weapon. "I want to name them," the SEAL said, his voice like a tank idling in a distant garage. Quiet. Lethal. Patient. For the record. For the board. For anyone who thinks this woman was just a nurse. He pointed to the medals one by one. Board members leaned forward. Bronze Star. Combat Operations, 2004. Hargrove's expensive watch caught the light as his hand moved toward the table edge, gripping it. Silver Star. Direct Action Mission, 2006. Saved 17 civilians during fire superiority operations. The room's silence became physical. Palpable. It pressed against everyone's chest like a weight. Second Silver Star. 2009, Kandahar Province. Hostage extraction under heavy fire. Hargrove's face drained. Not slowly. All at once. Like someone had pulled a plug. 2 Purple Hearts. Third cluster. The SEAL turned directly to Hargrove. Your ER director just tried to fire the woman who sacrificed more in 1 week of classified service than you've contributed in your entire career. The last medal hung in the air like a final judgment. Navy Cross. The words hit like a detonation. Amir Khan's hand moved to his chest, the same place where the scar lived, the same place Brooke's needle had entered between his ribs 48 hours ago to save his life a second time. His eyes didn't break from Brooke's, sitting silently in the back of the room. She didn't nod. She didn't move. She just held his gaze the way soldiers hold sacred ground. And then the door opened one final time. 2 figures in dark suits. Federal tattoos written all over them, the way they moved, the way they stood, the way the morning light seemed to move around them instead of through them. The woman spoke first, badge already visible, the kind of badge that made board members push their chairs back. Agent Maria Torres, FBI. This is Agent David Kim. We've been investigating Sacred Heart's billing patterns for 7 months. She opened a folder so thin it looked surgical. Printouts of financial records. Network logs. Electronic communications flagged in yellow highlighter like wounds. Equipment order number 47B, Torres continued, her eyes locked on Hargrove. Ordered by your department head here. Invoice, $128,000. The equipment arrived. Half of it was never used. The invoice was inflated by 40%. The vendor, Midwest Medical Supply Solutions, kicked back $54,000 to a shell company account. That shell company's signatory is Dr. Richard Hargrove. His name landed like the first punch in an interrogation room. We've documented $432,000 in fraudulent charges dating back 3 years, Agent Kim said, sliding photographs across the table. This is the pattern. This is systematic. This is theft. Hargrove's jaw worked. No sound came out. Torres stepped closer, her presence like a glacier moving toward him. But here's the part that matters for this meeting. 3 days ago, you accessed the hospital personnel database. You attempted to alter Brooke Sullivan's termination records. You tried to change the reason from insubordination to patient abandonment. You backdated incident reports. You created a false paper trail. She turned the monitor toward the table. Code. Timestamps. His user credentials highlighted in phosphorescent green. We've been monitoring your network activity since March. You were panicking because she was asking questions about billing discrepancies. You had to neutralize her before she went to compliance. So when she performed an emergency life-saving procedure, a procedure that was absolutely within scope, absolutely necessary, absolutely correct, you saw an opportunity. Hargrove stood so fast his chair toppled backward with a crack like a gunshot. This is insane. That woman was practicing beyond. She was practicing medicine at the level of a trauma surgeon, the SEAL team leader interrupted, stepping forward. His voice carried the kind of authority that made generals listen. And you destroyed her for it because she was close to uncovering your fraud scheme. That's called obstruction of justice. That's called conspiracy. Agent Torres nodded to her partner. They moved toward Hargrove from opposite sides of the table like executioners advancing on a stage. Dr. Richard Hargrove, you're under arrest for wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. The handcuffs appeared in Torres' hands like instruments materializing in an OR. The click of metal on metal. The way his wrists looked so small inside them. So ordinary. So guilty. Board members pushed back from the table, creating distance like he'd become contagious. The risk management investigator quietly closed his folder and stood, moving toward the door. Someone whispered into a phone. Someone else had already called security. Hargrove was led out through the hospital corridors in handcuffs, the same corridors where he'd humiliated Brooke, where he'd mocked her, where he'd thrown her chart to the ground. Past the ER nurses who stopped their charting and stared. Past the tech who'd witnessed him spill her cafeteria tray. Past the cafeteria itself, where a Costa cup still bore the coffee ring from the day he knocked her lunch to the floor. The perp walk was silent except for the rhythm of his dress shoes on linoleum and the whispers that followed like a ghost. Outside the hospital entrance, news cameras were already positioned. Someone had tipped them off. Flashbulbs erupted like artillery. Hargrove kept his head down, shoulders hunched, the kind of posture that confessed everything the cameras needed to see. 3 days later, Brooke Sullivan stood in the Oval Office. The presidential seal lay beneath her feet on carpet that cost more than most homes. She wore a simple navy dress, navy heels, her hair pulled back in the same austere style she'd worn in Kandahar. No makeup that couldn't survive the moment. No jewelry except her husband's wedding ring and her military insignia pin, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Marcus stood beside her in his father's service uniform, the one Michael had been buried in. The uniform fit him now. He'd grown into it. Tears moved silently down his cheeks without breaking his composure, the Sullivan composure, the one that had survived 2 decades of invisibility. The President of the United States stood before them, a small metal box in his hands. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, he began, reading from a document that contained classified operations stripped of classification just enough to honor them. For extraordinary heroism and sacrifice in service to this nation across 2 decades of operations the American people will never know the full details of. For saving lives at home and abroad. For choosing duty when you could have chosen silence. He pinned the Presidential Citizen's Medal to her chest. The weight of it was real. Specific. Heavier than medals usually are. In the front row, Amir Khan stood at attention, his dress uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, his scar catching the light like a badge of gratitude. The SEAL team leader stood beside him, hand over his heart. Camera flashes erupted like controlled explosions. That evening, Marcus drove his mother to the Veterans Cemetery in Savannah. Rain fell soft against the windshield, the kind of rain that sounds like forgiveness. They stood together at the grave of Michael Sullivan, 1971 to 2019, loving husband, devoted father, classified service, and opened the medal box between them. He would have been so proud, Marcus said, his voice steady now, the voice of a man who'd inherited his parents' strength. Brooke smiled. Finally. Truly. For the first time in 48 hours, the weight lifted from her shoulders like a helicopter ascending, rotors pushing the rain away. She placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder, his father's strength now flowing through him. He always said the truth finds a way to surface, she said quietly. That you can run, you can hide, you can bury yourself alive, but the truth doesn't get tired. The truth doesn't give up. Meanwhile, across town in a strip mall classroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams, Dr. Richard Hargrove stood in front of 12 board enrollment figures, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic CPR dummy for $14 an hour. His medical license was ashes. His reputation was ruins. His expensive watch had sold at auction to cover legal fees from a prosecution he'd lost in 4 days of testimony. The dummy's chest clicked under his palms. 100 compressions per minute. That's all his life had become, counting compressions for people who didn't care, getting paid enough to eat but not enough to sleep, teaching what he betrayed, every compression a reminder that he destroyed an innocent woman to cover his own theft. Brooke Sullivan returned to Sacred Heart Hospital as the new director of emergency medicine. Within 90 days, she implemented inventory controls that saved the hospital $870,000. She implemented billing audits that caught 3 additional fraud schemes in surgical supply. She trained the entire nursing staff on recognizing institutional corruption. She made it safe to speak truth to power. And she never again hid who she was. Because sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. They carry stethoscopes. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying.